Alright guys, welcome to the quarters of Asian Schools Debating Championship 2016. Let's congratulate both ATENEO teams for making it this far. Here. Judging with me is on my left is Biha, on my right is Amrit. Without any further ado on the motion, which is will be debated later. Let's welcome the Prime Minister to start the debate here.
Ladies and gentlemen, when once you have a childlike, ballistic, immature person as a sad excuse for a leader, the last thing you would want to do is to anger him because it poses a serious harm to both the people who flee from North Korea and the people left behind. What's the context that we need to establish coming from affirmative side? Firstly, North Korea has been a completely irrational actor when it comes to dealing with deals with the international community. Meaning that, for example, they're very aggressive when it comes to, for example, dealing with different sanctions imposed by other countries or even threatening and continuously doing things like nuclear testing or warfare as long as they have a legitimate reason to because of any sort of provocation coming from other external factors. Secondly, North Korea is politically unstable right now in the sense that you have Kim Jong-un's own advisors and a lot of, for example, members of parties trying to avoid conflict or aggressive actions in the case that other international community or other countries try as much as possible to compromise with North Korea and try to follow the armistice as strictly as possible. But lastly, when we're talking about people who defect, because we're talking about people who defect because they know that there's a very slight possibility that they might be accepted, despite the fact that you have a very, very high rate of people on the way getting out of North Korea, getting executed, getting caught by North Korean guards, and trying as much as possible to stop them. Our stance is very simple. We believe that the stance of affirmative is going to be clear and simple. We will actively pressure South Korea through things like economic sanctions and withdrawing our troops so that they are more likely to accept not prioritizing North Korean defectors. We think that South Korea values its relationship with other countries very much in the sense that they get most of the support coming from them. That's the reason why they're likely to accept it. We are willing to go hardline and bite our bullet and say that even if these defectors never get out of North Korea, that is a comparatively better trade-off than a world where Kim Jong-un gets aggressive and takes this aggression out on North Korean citizens, a world where North Korean refugees are shot on their way to cross the border, and a world where people who have the capacity for reform actually end up escaping, right? So I have two arguments today, right? Firstly, I'm going to talk about why it's more likely to incommensurately raise tensions against South Korea and why we're not willing to make that trade-off. Let's establish what's South Korea's duty when it comes to the armistice and dealing with North Korea, right? The international community has always tried to respect the armistice and has pressured South Korea to be able to do so. We think that the idea extends to not have free movement between those countries because that compromise, which is the armistice that they had, is the only reason right now as to why they're not at war. We think that it is in their interest to preserve that armistice as much as possible in the hope of future reunification, which is the reason why the armistice is treated as being temporary. They have to be able to reunify at some point. We need to try as much as possible to not give North Korea a legitimate reason to firstly be aggressive to South Korea and the international community. Meaning that when we characterize North Korea, like I said before, we're talking about them being known to threaten people in the 38th parallel once you have people, for example, crossing the border, being a lot more military aggressive when it comes to being able to try as much as possible to impose on its citizens, or for example, proudly showing off the fact that it has nuclear weapons. We don't think that these are types of threats that the international community or any other country should take lightly. We're not just going to say, oh, they really don't have nuclear weapons at all. We think that it's a legitimate threat and legitimate sort of risk that we are not willing to be able to take. Before I move on, fine.
Whether or not they have a reason, North Korea will always be aggressive. So what's the point in
No, North Korea is not always being aggressive. Like I said before, you completely dismissed the fact that a lot of Kim Jong-un's, for example, party members and a lot of his advisors are trying to avoid conflict as much as possible because they see that at some point, right, international community always tries as much as possible to compromise, always pushes for things like, for example, negotiation, tries to avoid conflict as much as possible and not piss off North Korea. So you're totally ignoring the fact that North Korea is always going to be aggressive because they're only aggressive when we give them a reason to. So why exactly is this argument extremely important? Why is it likely to then incommensurately raise tensions against South Korea? We think that this is a very, very small benefit when you have a minority of people, a very low percentage of people being able to get into South Korea while you have every single other person or every other country getting threatened by nuclear threats, getting threatened by things like, for example, at the border, and South Koreans trying as much as possible to fear, for example, North Korea, simply because this whole entire idea that they want to be able to make up for the fact that we, broke the armistice or broke the agreement and tried as much as possible to start accepting their citizens. We say that even in the case that we leave these people behind, we say that first of all, that was already not a very noble pursuit to begin with because usually most of them end up dying. Anyway, we think that trying as much as possible to be able to make that public announcement, tell them to not cross the border because we don't want a majority of you dying is a completely, legitimate trade-off for us that we're willing to be able to take. So let's go on to the second argument. Let's say that even in the case that they stay in North Korea, it is better to have internal reform. This argument is extremely simple, right? The premise here is that the current regime has always proven to be unstable, or already proven to be unstable, especially with several party officials within the government dissenting against Kim Jong-un and trying to advise him to divert away from aggression and divert away from conflict. This shows that while North Korea is irrational, reform is better possible when defectors stay within the country instead of allowing Kim Jong-un to have the propensity to abuse its citizens and say that this is a reason for us to be a lot more aggressive, say there's a reason for us to be a lot more oppressive to our own citizens because we don't want them escaping. The analysis here is that in this regard, we see two very important harms. Firstly, within North Korea, its own families and citizens are executed even more. We think that there's a trade-off that we are not willing to take, especially because even if they become refugees in South Korea, more significant numbers of North Korean citizens will be labeled and therefore executed. We think when it comes to this whole entire idea of deaths, if you want to be utilitarian, our side is better off. But secondly, we think that you reverse any potential for reform within North Korea when Kim Jong can continue to say that no, we cannot make any more compromises because South Korea is continuously being aggressive when it comes to taking our own citizens and violating our own armistice. We say that the trade-off here, and the reason as to why you have to accept affirmative actions, affirmatives model is because even if they're less likely to come out as defectors, they can shift their strategy to actually change and pressure the government inside. Meaning that when it comes to, for example, policies that we have right now, where for example, we have South Korean citizens touring North Korea, reuniting with their families for a short time, and then going back, those are the types of examples that we can use to be able to say that sometimes in these types of cases, North Korea is willing to make a compromise if it means as much as possible freeing up their movement and trying as much as possible to reunify slowly. So the conclusion to this argument is simple. Even in the case that they stay in North Korea, it's better to have internal reform because we don't want more people dying and we don't want to be able to reverse the sort of progress that has already been happening. At the end of the day, this debate is extremely simple. We know it's an extremely hard pill to be able to swallow to say that we're not going to accept any more people coming from North Korea. But we think if we're looking at the big picture, we have to try as much as possible to keep the armistice because that's our only hope of reunification and compromise with North Korea. For all these reasons and more, affirmative side is going to win this debate. Thank you.
Alright, thank you, Prime Minister. Now let's start the opposition case by welcoming the opposition leader. Here, here.
Honorable Speaker, we cannot change the fact that Kim Jong-un will be ballistic, that Kim Jong-un will be irrational. But that doesn't mean we have to succumb to his interests and allow him to continue to torture his own people in his own country. Why place the burden on the North Koreans? Why let them be in the torture house that they are? We believe that this is something abhorrent. We cannot stand for what the affirmative side does. We believe that we should have a reactionary measure. We continue to allow North Koreans and allow them to be prioritized in our side. We allow them to have a safe haven in South Korea, rather not be alienated or dispirited from what the people are. We do not want to succumb to the interest of Kim Jong-un, not this time. Our clash is simple. We tell you that the international community should not, at any case, pressure South Korea to not accept or to not prioritize North Korean defectors, because it widens the divide between South Korea and North Korea, and it can even widen proxy wars and even entire effort of unification in the very first place. They are very ignorant of what will happen to the people on their ground. They are very ignorant of what will happen in the long term at the end of the day. That's why affirmative should fall. Our 4 points of rebuttal towards the previous speaker. No, thank you. His proposal is that we're going to place economic sanctions on the people of South Korea. First response, why are you placing a burden on the South Korean people for doing a humanitarian cause at the very end of the day? Why are you disempowering their facilities? Why are you disempowering their industries just because their government wants to help, just because their government wants to have humanitarian aid in the first place? That is incommensurate, and that is something you're placing an extra burden on other people. And secondly, we can even spin that. Having economic sanctions can ruin the refugee effort and South Korea's interest as a whole. Because when you weaken their economy, you weaken their capability to accept refugees from any other country at the end of the day. You weaken their capability to defend themselves from North Korean missiles or North Korean aggression at the very end of the day. That's why you completely weaken South Korea on your side, placing a complete burden on their people, which shouldn't be necessarily happen. Second point of rebuttal. They said that we don't want to give a legitimate reason for North Korea to become aggressive. Sir, Mr. Speaker, we tell you at the very end of the day that North Korea will always be aggressive no matter what. That's why they continue to have three nuclear tests, to continue developing the nuclear missiles, because they always feel threatened. And you make them feel even more threatened when you say that your people don't deserve a safe haven, when you say that your people don't deserve a home or do these kind of things. That's why it's extremely inconsistent with their principle, saying that North Korea is irrational, then saying that they're rational enough not to give a legitimate reason. That's why it's completely inconsistent. But we can spin it. We give them an even greater reason to get mad at the world at the end of the day. Because Kim Jong-un now has a reason and his own people to say that they are the enemy of the world, that they should fear the world at the end of the day, because their people are not accepted in other countries, their people will not be given a safe haven in other countries. That's why you're giving them an even more greater reason for the North Korean people, not just Kim Jong-un, to face aggression towards the world. No. Then he said, the third point of rebuttal, they said they want to give them, the North Korean people, the impression or give them an announcement that we don't want you to die. Firstly, how will the North Korean people react to this? These people are as irrational as Kim Jong-un at the very end of the day, telling you that they will not see it as how we don't want you to die, but they will see it as we don't want you in our country because you're under Kim Jong-un, because you're under North Korea, because you don't deserve a safe haven. Their kind of policy is extremely discriminatory. Final point of rebuttal, they want internal reform. No, it is not likely to have internal reform, because when you have people inside your people, when you have people still under Kim Jong-un, when you have people still under his control, that gives him even less reason to reform, because there's no pressure, because people are not leaving, because he will believe that people are satisfied with their own kind of government. That's why no internal reform will happen. Secondly, why are you placing internal reform on the burden of the lives of the people in North Korea, not on Kim Jong-un or his political advisor? You're killing more people rather than having internal reform. Yeah.
It's a strategic flaw for you to say that Kim Jong-un will be aggressive all the time. What we want to look at is extent. That if you give him something to be aggressive for, he'll be more aggressive.
We tell you that even if he's more aggressive, there are already existing counterbalances that can stop that. But moreover, even if he becomes more aggressive, why are you placing it on the burden of the lives of the North Korean people at the end of the day? Why are you telling them that they don't deserve a safe haven and they just deserve to be tortured and died in North Korea? That is something that is inhumane in your side. First argument, how do you widen the divide between South Korea and North Korea? Firstly, you make, as the international community, you provide a disincentive for the North Korean people to pursue access to their own rights. You're telling them that North Koreans don't deserve help. You're telling North Koreans that they won't get help. And this international community actively promotes that sometimes you should deserve to be tortured, that sometimes you deserve to die for the greater good. That is something that we cannot necessarily do, especially to the people that have continuously been suffering under North Korea. But secondly, how is this extremely unstrategic? Because North Korea can use this as propaganda to provide tension to their people and anger their people even more. We tell you that, look at Kim Jong-un's processes, how he continues to manipulate his people. He says that I am your God and that the world is your enemy. That is even strengthened when you allow them to the international community to say that you are not part of this world. Why? Because did you allow Kim Jong-un to say and actively brainwash their people that the world will not accept you, that you don't have a home outside of the world, that they will just be there to reject you, and I am your safe haven, I will be there, we have to fight the war. That's how he becomes more aggressive. How is this bad? This is bad for North Korean people because they will will always continue to believe that their hermit kingdom is the safe haven they belong to, that the hermit kingdom is the only home they will be do. This is even worse for South Korea because they will always raise tension between South Korea rather than going for unification. They'll go for anything. There are enemies. We shouldn't have these allies. And this is even worse for the world because global cooperation is harder when the people of a dictator continue to support the dictator rather than the world. That's why this thing falls. But how does it harm? How does it increase proxy wars at the end of the day? Because it's harder for South Korea to cooperate when you allow them or when you actively pressure them to prioritize these kinds of things. Because it diminishes South Korea's humanitarian effort. It diminishes their interest in the global community and the global platform. You get harder to cooperate with South Korea because you say that your reasons are not as legitimate, because your reasons are not much. We don't care about you caring about the North Korean people. That's why it harms North Korean unification, because you brand North Koreans as aliens in South Korea. That's why it's even harder. That's why you widen the gap between those two states. Final argument. Why should especially the international community should not pressure South Korea? Because firstly, the use of pressure to do something in any kind of global front is not undemocratic and is one-sided. We tell you we should refrain from using pressure because it's a political weapon that now is used to manipulate humanitarian causes. We cannot tolerate that because it deviates from the very principle of what the international community stand for. It should stand for to recognize the rights of all people, recognize the autonomy of these people at the end of the day. We tell you that they delegitimize South Korean interests when it should have the interest to have its own state agenda. It delegitimizes the humanitarian cause of South Korea. That's why at the end of the day, they are unhumanitarian. They are not international community. We take this debate because we don't want people to be tortured and killed in North Korea. We take this debate because we recognize that South Korea has its own agenda and that the international community is using it as a political weapon to disenfranchise Koreans as a whole, to disenfranchise Korean unification. That's why opposition has to take this debate. Thanks.
Alright, thank you, Leader of Opposition. Now let's welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
This is a debate about extents. The extents of aggravation, the extents of conflict, and the extents of stability. The previous speaker has grossly misrepresented the context of this debate and the clear characterizations we gave to you coming from Hans in the Prime Minister's speech. If he agrees that aggression will always exist when we deal with North Korea, then we can clearly say that pressure on their side is not just a counterbalance towards North Korea, it is an incentive to create that same oppression towards its own people, an incentive to commit war towards South Korea and its own citizens. We would say that we are okay with the worst case scenario of allowing North Korea to be aggressive in a world where we do not have that pressure, because that aggression is one where we can be safer for citizens on the ground for North Korea, where they can be able to be stable right now. My argument in this debate is going to be very simple. I'm going to tackle the worst case of what the Leader of Opposition said towards our case, right? We're going to say that even in the worst case where North Korea maintains its hold on power, we say that North Korea and its citizens are comparatively going to be safer in the clutches of a developing country or a developing dictatorship. And I'm going to give you examples as to why when we reduce sanctions toward North Korea, they are more likely to protect its citizens by the development of its country when relying upon China. Before that, a few points for rebuttal towards his speech. Number one, the first characterization I want to look at is when he said that North Korea will always be aggressive and kill its citizens. Again, an argument that neglected extents but just talked about absolutes, right? Let's look back at this debate upon what strategy is. Number one, we said again, we first and foremost are very happy to say that the LO agreed with us that this is a quote-unquote reactionary policy, because we clearly said that North Korea is a reactionary measure and a reactionary actor, not just a constant oppressor that will always harm its citizens 100% all the time, no matter whatever you do. But it is one that will always escalate those tensions towards its own citizens whenever you threaten it with sanctions, such as when the United Nations Security Council raised tensions and sanctions on this country. It increased its hold on forced labor towards its own citizens. It increased its executions for its own party officials that it deemed to be corrupt or deemed to be not following international or the law of North Korea or whatever the dictator and Kim Jong-un wanted for its own countries. So their comparative is one where they continuously allow most citizens on the ground of North Korea to be jeopardized no matter what, or even be escalated. That's why the first characterization we said of on when when it is clear that traitors are go to South Korea and are accepted as refugees, though that the sanction that is done towards its own citizens is 3 generations of punishment and torture and killing of those same citizens. That is a comparative we are still unwilling to accept, and more preferably we would want for them to not come out as defectors anyways. But secondly, when the United States relaxed sanctions on North Korea to focus on its nuclear deal with Iran, we said it allowed North Korea to focus on trade with China and allowed it to develop further, to reduce its forced labor policies, to allow it to develop and focus upon development for its own citizens, especially when it didn't need to have more threats with its own nuclear deals or with its new nuclear proliferation with South Korea. It didn't need to be able to make those threats or large threats towards South Korea with war because there was no pressure for them to do so. We think that is a world we would rather prefer in comparison to one where they just allow them and legitimize the rhetoric that they have. But if they say that they will always be irrational, then they fail to respond to Hans' second argument, wherein we said all the more the rhetoric they say is legitimized, again, of extents. The rhetoric that they have will always exist on either side. But it is more legitimized when you allow them to say that they are deliberately accepting our traitors, they are deliberately partaking in an act of war against our country, and we can retaliate against that. That traitor dynamic is something that is not allowed, is something that focuses upon what the role of South Korea is in this war. South Korea's role was specifically to try as much as possible to remain a neutral actor that worked upon, whatever reunification we tried or whatever peace talks we can do with North Korea, but not one that deliberately acted in terms of accepting traitors into their country that North Korea deliberately wants to say that they want to be executed no matter what. That's the distinction, right? We're not accepting those traitors. They're accepting them and allowing that rhetoric to continue to exist. That is the war and conflict that will exist no matter what. But secondly, again, let's look upon what the comparative is and converse on their model. What Mati said in his speech was that we would have counterbalances and proxy wars in general are bad. Again, number one, we said that the proxy war already exists right now because of the idea that they are partaking in that conflict, accepting traitors deliberately into their country and giving them refugee status, giving them legitimacy of political asylum, giving them legitimacy to talk to the media, and then say that North Korea is completely doing wrong. It's just like when the United States accepts journalists from North Korea and they allow them to say that they are continuously betraying their own country, etc., etc. This is an inconsistency of characterization from their side, right? Because if he says counterbalances exist, then it should be true as well that North Korea is a reactionary actor that is less likely to escalate those tensions when it is not always going to be, when it doesn't have a reason always to escalate those tensions. Anyways, again, this is an argument against North Korea in general, not one that respected extents. No thank you. Argument as to why we say even in the worst case where North Korea maintains its hold on power, we say that North Korean citizens are comparatively safer in the clutches of a developing country. And this is the worst case, right? The complete worst case where we allow North Korea to always be a dictatorship and no success continuously happens. No thank you. The premise of this argument is very simple. 90% of North Koreans trade with $6 billion coming every year into China, from China into North Korea, is something that they incredibly rely on. China right now is against the acts of North Korea and its own escalation of tensions, right? So it rather prefers that they focus on development for its own countries, not on militarization, for them to focus on its own citizens, because that is a more comparatively better common good that we would rather prefer than the current government regime of continuously hitting on its own citizens, right? We say that with the more incentivization for economic development, it is less incentive for them to focus upon militarization and them to be able to have the idea and legitimacy that they can go to war with South Korea because they're already developing their own country. There's no reason for us to go in war and conflict and risk all the lives of North Korean citizens. We say that this policy, again, is a deliberate act of the acceptance of conflict and of war, and South Korea partaking in that same type of war when you accept refugees into your own country. We would rather prefer, therefore, that if we are not going to partake in this war at all, South Korea remaining a neutral actor as much as possible, work with the peace talks that we can have, whether or not they are successful, so North Korean citizens will always be safer under the development of their own country, such as when forced labor is reduced, when economic development for the entire country is going to increase, or when we allow citizens on the ground to not have an incentive to be defectors for their own country because their common economic situation is already being upholded and going to be benefited no matter what. Ladies and gentlemen, this debate is going to be clear once more. It's about extents and the extents of aggression, stability, and that same type of conflict, and we got no comparative whatsoever as to how they are able to try and address that. I am very proud to propose.
previous speaker clearly bit into our context when he said that the North Koreans are reactionary actors. We think that that's the primary idea that works in our case. Because if you look at the idea of legitimizing the international community in a war against these people, we think that's the type of propaganda that these people support. That's a type of fear that these people support. That's why it's so disincentivizing for these people to leave, because they see that North Koreans are the only way to actually protect these people. We think if you want to support the idea of Korean unification, it's by promoting these types of counter discourses, promoting that these people aren't going to be treated as second-class citizens and unequal when it comes to looking at the treatment. So let's go to a few rebuttals. Because if you look at the idea that he says that pressure makes it so much harder to negotiate, we think if you look at the primary idea, that's a type of idea that makes it much more easier for these people to actually actively disenfranchise the South, to actively make so much threats against the South. We think that that's a type of idea that makes it so much easier to make them prioritize the military. Because that, if you look at it that way, these people are more likely to prioritize the military rather than the citizens themselves. Because when Luigi decides to tell you that, hey, because of lessening sanctions, they're more likely to trade with China, we think that that's an unfair characterization for them to make. Because if you look at that time when they were actually trying to make that nuclear arms deal with Iran, we think that more of those funds coming from China was actively embezzled towards military spending. That's why they were able to create the third nuclear test in the past few months, and that's why they're able to consistently launch ballistic missiles into space and test satellites, because they're actively disenfranchising their citizens. We think if you look at the primary idea of fear in these North Korean citizens, that's the type of idea that persists when it comes to looking at how these people responding to the outside world. Second of all, about how if you look at bashing refugees, doesn't necessarily happen in status quo. If you look at that idea, when these people are into South Korea, we think the North Koreans are more focused on their saber rattling because they feel threatened when the international community decides to legitimize these actions against North Korea. That's why the primary idea of these people is to say that because the international community is against us, because the United States is against us, that's why it's all right to increase spending. That's why it's all right to overwork their citizens, because they know if they start dropping quotas, it's so much harder for them to keep up with the rest of the world. So we think if you look at the idea, these people are more inclined to increase their spending for these military. It's more inclined for these people to actively disenfranchise these people. No, thank you. We think if you look at the idea of trying to, you're just saying that this type of idea legitimizes traitors, we think that the primary idea is actually trying to legitimizing disenfranchising of these citizens. That's the reason why we need to actually uphold these people trying to be able to be prioritized in status quo. Because it's only when these North Koreans are able to see and actually able to talk to these people, that's the type of idea that makes it more amenable to change. I'm going to talk about the long-term benefits in my arguments as a whole before I go and go Luigi.
So what is it? Are they a constant irrational oppressor, or are they a reactionary actor to threats? Because in both contexts, it seems that it will still revert to even more aggression.
We think if you look at that primary idea that they're more likely to actually create those threats as a whole, we think they're trying to do that because the international community actively disenfranchises the North Korean state. Because of that idea, these people are more amenable to actually trying to not able to actually create that North Korean unification, because the whole world is belligerent against them. We think we're trying to support more multilateral talks. That's why it's so much easier for us to have more family gatherings between these peoples who are separated by the Korean War. So let's go to the first argument about how their side legitimized the idea that the North Koreans are second-class citizens. So let's talk about what it means to be a refugee as a whole. We think that these refugees are always on a subsistence basis. These people are provided basic pension. These people are provided basic housing. But what does this necessarily mean to be a refugee in South Korea? We think if you look at these ideas, these people are treated as second-class citizens. These people are actively being taken out of jobs. These people have no job security when it comes to looking at the North, how these North Koreans are able to get jobs in Korea. We think if you look at the primary idea, these people are seen as second-class citizens because they're actively taking away these types of benefits as a whole. So let's talk about the brainwashing, how the brainwashing works in North Korea, and how this necessarily actively legitimizes the South Korea and the United States are necessarily belligerents in this war. We think if you look at the idea, citizens are necessarily second class. That if you're in the military, you're the people who are going to be favored. If you're a general, you're going to get more benefits with regards to like salary and all those things. We think if you look at that primary favoring North Korea and state, we think that's a type of idea that makes it so much easier for these defectors to move out of this country. That's why it's so much easier for these people to actually actively have that discourse, especially now when the border between China and North Korea becomes porous, when they're being actively taught that the world is actually much better as they were not taught in like North Korean schools. So we think if you look at the idea, because we are now actively legitimizing the idea that the international community is against the North Korean state, that's the type of idea that allows the North Korean state to thrive on fear. Because if you look at status quo, the North Koreans are already trying to thrive on this idea of fear. That's why it's so much easier for the discourse to persist when you decide to force the international community to like make necessary actions against the North Korean state. That's why unification is not gonna happen. Because now, discourse is only gonna be one-sided to the North Korean state. Discourse now persists on the idea that you're never going to be safe regardless or not whether you're in North Korea or you're in South Korea. Because when these people are actively, that's why it's so much easier for these people to be trapped as a whole. Now they begin to fear the West as like some necessary, some enemy who's willing to go against the people of like North Korea because they're like their families are being actively disenfranchised in the South Korean state. So we think when it comes to looking at countering discourse, that's why the primary idea of the humanitarian cause, coming from my first speaker, is the best idea when it comes to trying to counter the fear. Because if you look at the idea of like the humanitarian cause, we think when it comes to allowing these people to be treated equally as North Koreans, when it comes to allowing these people, families to meet after the Korean War, it makes it much more amenable to change because now you have multilateral discourse that persists between these Koreas, and we think unification is more possible when you have multi-party talks, when these people are more amenable to change. So if you're going to say that the North Koreans are reactionary actors, they are going to try to react to this change, and we think it's going to be in a much better way than what your side proposes. Thanks.
Alright, thank you to the Leader of Opposition. Now let's welcome the government with here.
Mr. Speaker, when you try to escape from a ballistic government, chances are the intense amount of weapons and artillery they have on the border will kill you in that pursuit. But in the off chance that you somehow escape, you have to understand that you aren't escaping from suffering, but rather submerging 3 generations of your family to that same suffering. Through your escaping, you have actively preserved. We think that opposition side cannot claim values such as discourse and compromise when they bite into the characterization of Kim Jong-un being an aggressive and irrational actor. Because by them allowing their people to go to South Korea, you give them a higher propensity to be aggressive and a higher propensity to close his ears and not listen to you. That's why we have to tackle 3 fatal flaws that cost opposition side this debate. Their first fatal flaw is that opposition side concedes that Kim Jong-un is irrational but have the end goal of reunification on their side. That's unlikely because on their side, Kim Jong-un will never listen when you take his people. Because essentially, when you have his people escaping, it looks like his government looks illegitimate, which makes him more mad and more irrational. But their second fatal flaw is to assume that Kim Jong-un will ever instigate reform when they complain that the problem coming from our side is that we passes the burden of reform to the citizens rather than the leader. But they have to understand that that crazy leader will never take the burden of reform for himself because he thinks that this is against his interest. That's why their counter model or their counterbalance of passing the burden to the leader is unlikely pursuit. But the third and most fatal flaw is to shift their characterization. Because when DLO says that North Korea is a reactionary character, it shafts the characterization coming from the leader of the opposition that he will be aggressive all the time, making him have preemptive tendencies. So these flaws shows you that the strategical flaw coming from opposition side is their shifting of their characterizations to conveniently suit whatever they're saying. 2 questions to justify the win for government side. Firstly, does our policy strengthen the leadership and the government of Kim Jong-un? What they said coming from opposition was yes, because Kim Jong-un will use this policy to antagonize South Korea and everyone else. There's a simple response to that. Kim Jong-un will never use that because he doesn't want people to escape because it will be taken against his interest to show an illusion of stability. Meaning it's in his interest not to even report that people defect because he wants his people to feel like there is no reason for you to leave this country, we are perfectly fine. That's why he tries to hide any effort or any evidence of things like poverty or the lack of food supplies within North Korea. But this is where we have to compare and engage the even if. Even if to an extent that happens, we think that is comparatively worse on your side because he already does that through various means of propaganda. Meaning, when you give him a reason to further make his propaganda more intense because people are not buying into it and leaving, that becomes a comparatively worse harm coming from their side. But what did we say coming from our side? We said no, because our side creates an impetus for reform. And this is the only response we get coming from them. They say that we ought not pass the burden of reform onto the citizens because that's the job of a leader. We think that that type of response would be perfectly fine if you're not talking about a dictator who is crazy and unresponsive to things like the international community. We think if they're going to rely on the leader to instigate reform, that reform is never going to be favorable to the people because that is a direct clash with what his interest is. But secondly, even if to an extent that we concede that we are passing the burden on the people, we think that that is a strategic burden for us to pass in order to make the people get the reform they need. And then they try to salvage their case in this issue by saying, but North Korea is more likely to compromise coming from their side as well. We find that type of response messy because they've already conceded to the characterization of aggression. This is where we have to weigh in likelihoods. Given that he is aggressive, what is his likely response? We think he is more likely to respond with more aggression rather than compromise because he does not want to look weak. That's why even if people appear content on their side because they are no longer being accepted and being kept in, we think that that negates the fact that people will eventually undergo suffering that will push them to discontent. These are things like feeling hungry because they don't have enough food. And we think that is enough impetus for people to ignore whatever propaganda they have because at the end of the day, the suffering they feel within that regime does not concretize their plight. So how do we reconcile this issue properly? We think it's very clear that government's policy of not accepting the refugees does not strengthen the leadership and the government of Kim Jong-un because our side exclusively creates this idea of an impetus of reform. We think it is tragic that the people who have the capacity for reform are usually the ones who lead. Yes, sir.
Where is North Korea more likely to saber rattle? When you legitimize the idea of the international community going against them, or when you become more humanitarian to them?
We think that even if you become humanitarian to them, they won't admit that this was help from the international community, but make it look like this was from the regime, thus enter the rhetoric that you ought not to dissent against us because we are giving you everything you need. Second question. This is where we engage the even if. That's something that they fail to do consistently coming from opposition. Even if North Korea forever remains a dictatorship, is our policy still justified? What we said coming from our side, that it was perfectly justified because even if we take a look at the situation we are now, we'd rather have that on the comparative than give him a reason to make situations worse. Because what are they ignoring coming from their side? The fact that he is making things like the 3-generation punishment. The fact that he is strengthening those borders to prevent people from coming in. And that's why their response of this idea that he's going to use this rhetoric to antagonize them further doesn't make sense because that's something that's going to exist regardless. That's why we have to take down the argument coming from the previous speaker. The idea that refugees will now be treated better because you have ideas like things like compromise. We think that idea of compromise cannot exist when you characterize this leader as obliterately evil and aggressive. But we say that even if discourse on your side becomes one-sided, we think that discourse is tremendously tokenistic because it's never going to materialize something, particularly if it is against North Korean interests. So what does this issue show you? This issue essentially shows you that even when we engage our worst case scenario of no reform at all, we think no reform at all is better than having reform that leads to a negative effect to the people you leave within that ground. Because what they have to understand is that the refugees who flee are tremendously selfish because they are never going to seek change because they leave a system of suffering onto their people, and we think it's high time we stop tolerating that system. Thank you.
this debate. Let's welcome the opposition whip. Here.
What government side needs to understand is that the way North Korea will always try to thrive within their country is through the idea of propaganda. But what we need to understand and what we need to basically weigh is what extents or what are going to become the capabilities for him to ever push that sort of propaganda at the end of the day on both sides. I'm going to talk about three issues that came up within this debate. First, I'm going to question, how do both sides affect North and South Korean relation at the end of the day? That's what the first exchange really wanted to tackle. But moreover, I'm also going to talk about and question, what is the best way to actually cater to North Korean citizens? This is moreover the second exchange. But then last, this is what basically the whip built. I'm going to question, when is it actually more likely to gain reform and concessions from someone as irrational as Kim Jong-un? On the first issue, let's question, how do both sides actually affect North and South Korean relation? How do they try to reconcile this issue? They told us on the first point that you're more likely to increase tensions because you help and directly go against North Korean policies after the first issue. First, we have 2 points of response to this. First, North Korea is always aggressive. By the way, that is they completely did not respond to that point on them. But moreover, the reason why they will always be aggressive, no matter what and to who, is because sanctions are continuously being put on them, and it directly goes against what they want. It directly goes against the things that they're trying to push for. Meaning that sort of aggression will be pushed for on any point on any side at the end of the day. But moreover, even on the second point of response, even if you actually create tension, their likelihood of massively retaliating and responding to that at the end of the day is completely diminished when the likelihood of losing civil support is so much bigger on our side, because the propaganda then is no longer going to be justified when you completely accept North Koreans. That's why our Depp's case was so important. When he told you that it would be so harmful for that sort of propaganda that, for example, South Koreans are pigs and they will completely disenfranchise you. That's why it's completely harmful when something like that is completely ratified. I told you after this first issue. But moreover, on the second point that they tried to bring to us, they told us that you're able to combat his regime by keeping these defectors within North Korea. That's pretty much a weird point. We have 3 points of response to this. First, we question, what is the likelihood for them to ever fight in North Korea, where it's so much easier for a civilian who has continuously been oppressed and abused to ever fight back, especially when they characterized the North Korean military to be able to silence them and to be able to kill them off with their clearly superior weaponry at the end of the day. So on the second point, right, we tell you it is more likely for North Korean defectors to ever fight against that North Korean regime when they have a backing in a safe haven where their voices are welcomed. That's only going to happen when you continuously try to accept them into places like North Korea. But thirdly, on a third point of response, even if they do combat the regime through this, we tell you it's at the expense of thousands of harmless civilian lives. Meaning, what they're basically going to cause at the end of the day is a civil war. And what they try to characterize to us as a neutral actor at the end of the day is something that wants to instigate no war at all. So if they don't want to instigate any war, we tell you that that's only going to try to instigate, well, that's inconsistent because they try to instigate a civil war on their own. Anyone?
If you want to talk about dissent and talk about whether it's more likely when those that have backing in the state, how is that compatible with their characterization that these North Koreans will forever be irrational?
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah. The thing is, the possibility for North Koreans to ever rationalize will never, for the possibility for North Koreans to ever rationalize will be completely diminished when you only allow one sort of narrative to thrive and one sort of idea of propaganda to thrive, and that's the North Korean narrative at the end of the day. Moving over to the second issue, what is the best way to cater to North Korean citizens at the end of the day? On the first point, they try to bring us to reconcile this issue. They tell us that lessening sanctions will basically make North Korea more likely to make them more likely to cater to their citizens more. First, that is completely assumptive because that assumes that the corrupt government that they characterize themselves will ever bring those benefits to its people at the end of the day. But moreover, on a second point of response, even if they cater to their people, we tell you that that makes it more possible for that sort of propaganda to thrive. Because at the end of the day, you're going to allow North Korea to claim that they're going strong, that they are growing stronger at the end of the day. That's the type of hermit rationality that they're going to continue to instigate at the end of the day, and they're going to continually create the capacity of happening. But moreover, what else did they try to bring to us on this issue? They told us that South Korea should remain a neutral actor. 2 points of response to this. First, we question, should they actually be a neutral actor? Or is it actually justified to force them to only become a neutral actor? Because North Korea has historically been oppressing their own people who are still Koreans at the end of the day. Meaning, we question, why would South Korea ever stand idly by as their own people are continually being abused, as their own people are continually being killed off, and things like that? But second, on an even if point, even if South Korea should remain a neutral actor, no thank you. Even if they should remain a neutral actor, we question that extent, because shouldn't a neutral we question that characterization, because shouldn't a neutral actor at the end of the day not discriminate against certain people when they accept refugees at the end of the day? So if they wanted South Korea to become a neutral actor, why did they want them to become a neutral actor that discriminates against North Koreans and push them away at the end of the day? But lastly, on the last issue, we question, when is it more likely to gain reform and concessions from Kim Jong-un? The first point they brought to us is that he won't want to reform because he will only become angry. First, his strength is completely linked to his own people, meaning not being able to have any hope at all of escape, meaning it's completely linked to not having any hope at all of escaping him. Meaning, at the end of the day, on our side, what's more likely to happen is he's more likely to actually want concession, because he's not necessarily going to have the upper ground at all times, because they have at least some sort of possibility of escaping his ruling. But the second point they brought to us is the idea that he will basically hide all the stories so no one will listen. They tell us that that's a fatal flaw. But we tell you, what will happen from a North Korean citizen being turned away? What will happen then? We tell you, if a North Korean citizen is turned away by South Korea and he comes back to North Korea, that issue is instantly going to be blown up. It's going to allow North Korea to propagandize even further. That's what happened in the North Korean and South Korean War, when they tried to show that South Korean soldiers defected to the North Korean side. That only strengthened their propaganda at the end of the day. We're very proud to oppose.
Alright, thank you all for listening. Now let's go on to the reply sections. And a reminder to the floor for the audience to remain silent and keep their cheering and jeering to a minimum, because it might distract the judges listening to the speakers. So now let's welcome the opposition reply speaker. Here.
The fault of government bench is to say it's okay for more and more people to suffer and die for the slight chance of reunification. They take the loss because they were unreasonable. They take the loss because they were illogical, saying that it's okay to take on the extremely high burden to allow more and more people to die for a slight chance, for a slight goal, just to please one angry leader. They took this debate on the loss under 3 points. Firstly, do North Koreans deserve protection? Because they wanted to paint this debate in a way, it's okay for North Koreans to die because we want to take a bigger picture and accept the trade-off. This is on burdens and goals. They took an incredibly high and irrational burden to say that it's okay for human beings to continuously be tortured and die in North Korea. It's okay for them to do these kinds of things for a slight chance of a goal of reunification, or just simply to please Kim Jong-un, a completely irrational leader. They went into the extremely hard-line stance saying that it's okay for these North Koreans to not be robbed of their rights. It's okay for them to be underprivileged and to die in North Korea in the very first place. And their goal was simply just to please Kim Jong-un, not necessarily to defend North Korea or to make what is better for them, just to make sure that their angry leader won't get any worse. That's why they're completely irrational in their burden, that they have very completely reasonable goals. While in opposition side, we gave you a more nuanced and more reasonable kind of goal. We told you from the very first point why the international community cannot tolerate more North Koreans dying, why they don't have the right to pressure these individuals, because it is something that we do not want to tolerate, because South Korea has its own autonomy and all these kind of things. We also told you at the very end of the day that we proved that their kind of model was completely unstrategic, because they can continue to antagonize the world, what North Korea will do in their side. And we told you why we shouldn't necessarily blame it on South Koreans, why we shouldn't their proposal was not necessarily legitimate, why the economic sanctions were not necessarily true. That's why we were more nuanced and we gave you a more reasonable burden rather than telling you that North Koreans deserve to die because Kim Jong-un might get angry if they leave. That's why they were completely rational in saying that when do North Koreans deserve protection, they don't because it's okay. That is a completely unreasonable burden. Secondly, will North Korea escalate its aggression? The engagement of government was very little, was almost close to none. Because they refused to engage in our debate, where we tell you that the chance of proxy wars, the chance of antagonizing and demonizing the world in the eyes of North Koreans, and the chance of Kim Jong-un even still using it as a strategic way to oppose the world, they never necessarily responded to that. They just responded to that we were inconsistent, giving us technicalities, and that's never necessarily sufficiently saying why their model was necessarily strategic, and never necessarily tried to respond to why their proposition of economic sanctions is necessarily essential. Well, we responded to the entire model. We even questioned their context from the very get-go, saying, is North Korea really reactionary? We tell them it's completely they are completely aggressive, and we even told you that we even gave you an even if they're reactionary, they'll react more violently because you're disenfranchising their own people. That's how you antagonize these kinds of things. And secondly, we even gave you the meta debate, whether or not North Korean lives weigh more than a chance of reunification. We tell you that we are more humanitarian when we give these kinds of benefits. And thirdly, we responded to the DPM case and tell you North Koreans are not safe in North Korea because they'll always be deprioritized, they'll always be seen as second-class citizens, they'll never get the kind of benefits that they deserve at the very end of the day. That's why more North Koreans suffer, that's why their slight chance of reunification is not necessarily going to happen. Finally, on consistency and their model, will their model necessarily solve the issue? What is the ideal world? Because government completely dropped their model of economic sanctions. They never answered to us why the South Korean people deserve to be sanctioned, why they deserve to be disempowered, and they never even evolved to justify that kind of model in the very first place. They even conceded to our frame that they will be tortured in North Korea and that all these kinds of things. That's why they completely dropped their first speaker in the very stance. Why we tell you that we are consistent throughout the entire bench, that we cannot tolerate the suffering that they want to tolerate, that we cannot tolerate the kind of logic that their government, and even went on to even ifs on these sides. We take this debate because we are the more reasonable team. We told you that these North Koreans deserve protection, that their model is completely unstrategic, that Kim Jong-un can still use it against them, and that they were inconsistent to the point that they dropped their proposal. That's why opposition will take this debate.
All right, to wrap up the quarterfinals of ASDC 2016, let's welcome the government reply speaker. Here.
Opposition will lose this debate because they failed to prove their idealistic counter-model of happily accepting refugees, having reunification, and stopping all forms of brainwashing in their world. Especially if even up until the opposition reply, they agree that Kim Jong-un is reactionary and irrational at all costs to only oppress its people. We are not pleasing Kim Jong-un. We are just being strategic with this dictatorship, and that is the difference that is only going to make government win. There are two things we're going to look at in this speech. Number one, we're going to look at the characterization of North Korea, and secondly, we're going to look at the worst case scenario. Number one, on how we characterize North Korea and how they react. In both characterizations that they gave from opposition of how North Korea reacts, they have failed to respond to the extents of that reaction, since it's clear that their counter-model wasn't even proven to the likelihood and even to the extent that it would somehow be realistic, that they can somehow solve all problems on their model. We worked on every single case as to why, even if they were evil, we would somehow still be able to have some semblance of stability, relative stability towards their world. First, on the irrationality of North Korea. Firstly, if they they are irrational and if they are evil, yes, that is not mutually exclusive. We agree on that, but it only means that their world makes it worse, especially if their world allows the pressure to jeopardize the safety of North Korea's own citizens. They didn't even respond to the idea that when sanctions are given to North Korea, it doesn't even stop them from negotiating. It doesn't stop them from oppressing its own citizens. It just continuously depriving of their own citizens of North Korea from that same aid that you try and give to them. Even up until the opposition whip, they said that even if you try to give humanitarian aid to North Korea, it does nothing. So it is clear that you can show that in their world, nothing is going to change. More people are going to be harmed when you use pressure against North Korea. They will only seek to preserve the regime instead of being able to try and work towards compromise. But moreover, it never was just about accepting refugees and stopping brainwash. That's just the model, counter model that they never really proved on their side. We said comparatively, it is still better than the undeniable suffering that you have when you accept a refugee. Because we said 3 generations of families are going to be tortured and plundered under the world where you allow North Korean citizens to be traitors towards their own country, or South Korea to partake in that treason against their own country. That is a comparative model that we will not accept in a world where at least we will have that compromise in our side. Secondly, in terms of them being a reactionary actor, will they react with compromise or do they react with more aggression? And again, we resolve this better in terms of likelihood and in terms of incentives. We said that the incentive, and even they agreed to this to some extent, was that the incentive of North Korea was to show force or to be able to legitimize any rhetoric it has that tries to threaten the regime that currently exists. That's why in terms of propaganda, we said that propaganda is something that is going to be worse upon a model when they allow the propaganda and brainwashing to exist, when you allow North Korean citizens to be traitors and be refugees and allow South Korea to partake in that same treason. It legitimizes that rhetoric of militarization and spending on the military instead of being able to use that on other things such as development, which they still didn't respond to. So, what is the most likely scenario to occur? We said that the only option left is to preserve that regime to the death, at the cost of suppressing any chance for defects towards its own country, or to allow them to continuously force South Korea into the conflict in itself. And even on their side, in terms of pressuring South Korea, they have no model whatsoever to say that it is legitimate for you to allow South Korea to partake in a conflict that it does not want to be opted into no matter what. We think that treason, that conflict was something they never subscribed to, something that is against the sovereignty of that same country. Secondly, in terms of the worst case scenario, and again, they still failed to prove a model where accepting refugees is comparatively better at the cost of heightened aggression. And here, they just reverted back, even in deputy and even at opposition whip, to an argument in favor of accepting refugees in general instead of understanding the cost of accepting that refugee, which is the same aggression, same oppression towards its own citizens that will only get worse on their model. Ladies and gentlemen, this debate is clear. It is about extents of that conflict, on that stability, and only on our side we were able to solve that in all respects. I'm very proud to propose.